Jesse Hagopian teaches history and is the Black Student Union Advisor at Garfield High School in Seattle, the site of the historic boycott of the MAT test in 2013. Jesse is an associate editor of Rethinking Schools magazine, is a founding member of Social Equality Educators, SEED, a teachers union activist organization, was the recipient of the 2012 A. Public Foundation Award for Excellence and Innovation in Peace Education, and won the 2013 Secondary School Teacher of the Year, awarded from the Academy of Education of Arts and Sciences. Jesse's commentary on education has been featured on such programs as Keith Olbermann's Countdown, CNN, the Dan Rather Report, Democracy Now!, the Real News Network, and NBC's Education Nation. Jesse is the author, also, I'd like to show this, of a forthcoming book called More Than a Score, Stories from the New Uprising Against Standardized Testing, and is a frequent contributor to Truth Out, Common Dreams, Black Agenda Report, Socialist Worker, and the Seattle Times op-ed page. And this is Jesse's blog, so I will, with no further ado, give you Jesse himself, so please join me in welcoming.
Thank you so much, Francine. It's been wonderful to get to know this community over lunch and see downtown. So thanks for inviting me and everyone who helped make it possible. I came over from Garfield High School today. In Seattle, you might have heard of my school. It's the school that Jimi Hendrix went to, the school that Bruce Lee transformed martial arts came from. It's the school that Quincy Jones attended, who remade American music, producing Thriller, for example, the highest selling album of all time. And aren't we glad that he wasn't stuck in a class with standardized tests and not allowed to think creatively, right? But we are in the middle of the biggest revolt against standardized testing in the history of the United States. There has never been more activity of communities, of parents, students, teachers, educators, administrators, organizing for a broader definition of knowledge, right? And organizing to reclaim our classrooms from testing companies that is happening right now. And I want to tell you my story today of how Garfield High School helped ignite this movement that is spreading across the country at rapid speed. I just got a Facebook message on my way over to this meeting from a parent in Florida who's organizing a boycott of a standardized test and wants to discuss how to do it. And I get these on a regular basis now. It's pretty amazing. But I want to tell that story, but before I do, I want to talk a little bit. When I say it's the largest movement in the history of the United States against standardized testing, I want to take a minute to look at what that movement has looked like before. Arne Duncan, Secretary of Education, and Bill Gates and the other key figures in the testocracy have said that testing is, and education is the civil rights movement of our time, and testing is the key to implementing that civil rights movement because it'll create accountability. And I had an opportunity to, during the Occupy movement, we had an Occupy education rally and we marched on the Gates Foundation and we challenged them to a debate and they came down. I couldn't believe it. They actually sent a couple of poor souls to face real educators, people who had been in the classroom before and knew something about education. And the first question I asked them in this debate, it was great. We had a bullhorn, right, and like hundreds of people behind us. And I said, where did standardized testing come from, right? This is a policy that you are promoting to transform public education, to test in every grade, and now with Common Core, we're seeing the just absolute explosion of standardized tests. You want more stakes tied to these tests for teachers and students. So if so much of your policy is about this, where did these tests come from? How did they enter the public schools? I'm a history teacher. I'm interested in these things. And they couldn't answer. So I answered it for them. Standardized testing entered the public schools in the 1920s. In the wake of World War I, they developed IQ tests that were used to screen recruits in the military for who was going to be cannon fodder and die in the trenches, and who was officer material, right? So ranking and sorting. And the efficiency movement and the eugenics movement, an openly white supremacist ideology, a pseudoscience designed to prove white male superiority over immigrants, right? Over women, over Native people, over African Americans, right? The eugenics movement was the primary driver of having standardized testing enter the public schools as a way to demonstrate white superiority. And they weren't as shy about saying it back then, right? They were proud of that. And Carl Brown, who designed the SAT, you can go read his work. He's a proud and open eugenicist, right? Who thought that this science would settle the issue of intelligence once and for all. So today it's the civil rights issue of our time. Back then it was much more open about the role of standardized testing. And the movement against standardized testing, I'm proud to say as a black educator, I think first really got started with W.E.B. Du Bois, who founded the NAACP, was in the Socialist Party, and many other black intellectuals and scholars who clearly saw these tests for what they were, right? A tool of racial control, of class division, and reproducing inequality in our society. And so I want to just read to you a quote from Horace Van Bond, who wrote in his work Intelligence Tests and Propaganda. In the 1920s, he wrote this. But so long as any group of men attempts to use these tests as funds of information for the approximation of crude and inaccurate generalizations, so long as we must continue to cry, hold. To compare the crowded millions of New York's East Side with the children of Morningside Heights, an upper-class neighborhood, indeed involves a great contradiction. To claim that the results of the tests given to such diverse groups, drawn from such varying strata of the social complex, are in any way accurate is to expose a fictitious sense of unfairness and lack of appreciation for the great environmental factors of modern urban life, right? And so this movement against standardized testing stands in a great tradition of social justice activists who for a long time pointed out the way these tests are used to reproduce inequality. And there's been acts of individual resistance for some time of teachers refusing to give these tests because they see the way they're culturally biased. They see the class time they're eating up. They see these tests replacing critical thinking and begin to resist giving them individually. But today we're seeing mass collective acts of resistance. In Chicago, they have a campaign that the Chicago Teachers Union launched called Let Us Teach. And they have 2 schools in Chicago that are actively boycotting a state-mandated standardized test. The teachers are refusing to administer this test. It started at Sasado Elementary School with a courageous staff there that is refusing to give it. And of course, they immediately met threats beyond what even we at Garfield were threatened with. That in Chicago, they are now threatening them revoking their teaching certificate so they can never teach again, right? And now in New York, there are 2 schools actively refusing to administer standardized tests. You have the Earth School, elementary school, where they got, last year it was 30% of parents to opt out. This year it's up to 70%, and 3 teachers at that school actively refusing to administer a Common Core, right, state-mandated standardized tests. And then I got a call not too long ago from a teacher at International High School in New York that mostly serves immigrant children. And they designed a new standardized test to test these children that the faculty there felt was culturally and linguistically inappropriate. And they voted unanimously, I think, save 1 teacher to refuse to administer this test, and sent a letter explaining why that everybody should read. It's really moving. You have, in New York State, you have 33,000 parents who have opted their kids out of standardized testing this year. It's absolutely incredible, the numbers. There have been walkouts in Chicago, in Philadelphia, in Colorado, of students refusing to take these tests, and not just individually, but organizing their fellow students. My favorite, that's in a story that's in the book of students in Rhode Island, they did the zombie march, right? Just marching to the Department of Ed, showing what these tests do to your brain, right? Very visually. And there's walkouts in Portland. So it really is parents, students, teachers all coming together to refuse to give these tests. And I don't know if people saw, like, why is this happening right now? I don't know if you saw Louis C.K. on the Letterman show the other night explaining. Letterman says, how's it going? Oh, it's pretty good, but my kids are in testing season right now, so there's some pressure. And Letterman asked him, yeah, I know, I've heard about that. It seems like there are more and more consequences and stakes attached to these tests. And Louis says, yeah, it's my understanding if you don't pass these tests, they burn your school down. Which is funny, but it's also not that far. It's funny because it's a little bit uncomfortably true. It's not that far from what they do. In Chicago, they just closed 50 schools. They scored a couple dozen in Philadelphia. They label and they punish, and that's why our movement has grown so big. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how I became a teacher activist, and then describe this boycott that we launched. I started I did the Teach for America program, which I'm not proud of, and people can find out more about why. But I taught in Washington, D.C. I was told that this was going to be the civil rights movement, and in 5 weeks I was going to learn how to save the children in the ghetto, which wasn't quite true. I had to go back to school to actually learn the craft of teaching. But I did learn a lot, even if I didn't teach a lot in those years. I learned a lot myself. And here I am driving past the White House on my way to school, and I pass the Anacostia River, and now I'm in a completely different world. A third world country that is right there in the seat of power, with a school that's literally falling apart. And the first assignment I ever assigned was show and tell. I was teaching 5th grade, and I gave the kids brown paper bags to take home with them and bring back an object that really explained who they were, something that was very meaningful to them and could tell us about who you were. And so we got in our circle the next day. This is the first thing I've ever done as an educator, and we go around, and first kid takes out a driver's license. It's a picture of their dad who was killed over the summer. Hard way to start teaching, and I don't really know what to say to the student, and I haven't been prepared to deal with that. The next student has a picture of an uncle who's in jail who they haven't seen because oftentimes the facility is in a different state and they don't get to visit. And every single one of my students in the entire circle had a picture of a dad or an uncle who was either dead or in prison. And you get a window into a society that's in absolute crisis, right? And that they just want to segregate off the problem and not deal with it. And it's the same year, I began teaching in 2001, the same year as two other things. One, No Child Left Behind, right? Federal policy comes online. And now, all of a sudden, I'm being blamed. The teachers in the classroom are being blamed for our society, the problems in our society, when we see, the school-to-prison pipeline, federal mass incarceration, federal policies gutting education funding, and that now we're to blame, right? And it's the ramp-up of standardized testing. And at the very same time, right, the first month of my teaching career, I see the smoke rising off the Pentagon from the attacks on 9/11. And then just within a few weeks of that, all of a sudden our entire nation is gearing up for war. And we're still in the middle of that war, right? Longest war in U.S. history. And I saw our nation, with a snap of its finger, mobilize untold vast amounts of resources to go bomb children and destroy schools halfway across the world, but they could not mobilize that wealth, right, to fix the hole in the ceiling of my classroom that destroyed, the rain came in and destroyed the first research project I ever assigned to those students. And so that was my education. And why I realized that it wasn't going to be enough just to be an educator in the classroom and give the best I could to my students, because there are structural problems that are, whether it's standardized testing or it's funding or it's a war machine that's getting ready to take my students and send them to die in a war halfway around the world. That we have other problems that aren't allowing us to teach that we have to address simultaneously. And so I went back to school and came back to my hometown of Seattle and went to the University of Washington and finally learned the craft of teaching. And I taught middle school, and then I was laid off with the Great Recession in 2008 and the budget cuts, learned again about the priorities of a society that allows bankers to get golden parachutes after they sabotage the global economy, and then proposes race to the top and more test and punish policies at the very same time that education budgets are being slashed. So then a great turn of events happened for me that I was rehired at my alma mater at Garfield High School. And it's been an incredible few years there. And last year, I got a call in January during lunch. A teacher called me up and said, can you talk after school sometime? I have something we need to discuss. And I'm used to getting calls from teachers. I was a building rep at Garfield High School. I am the building rep there. And so people have questions about the contract, issues in the building they want to discuss. So I'm used to coming and meeting with teachers and talking to them. So I didn't think much of it. I went there after school, and Mallory Clark, our amazing reading teacher there, sat me down and looked me in the eyes and said, Jesse, I'm not going to administer the MAP test this year. And I wanted to jump up on the table and pump my fist. I've been organizing against this test. I helped get a resolution passed in our union the year it was first adopted against the test. I've written articles about the way the test exacerbates racial inequality. And here was a teacher ready to throw down and refuse to give it. And I said, well, you know, if it's just you, there was a famous teacher in Seattle who was punished for not getting the test and driven out. You know, and she knew that story, and she'd already talked to colleagues about the need to make it beyond an individual act, and we began discussing this in all of the tested subject areas, you know, language arts, math, ELL, special education departments, and we held lunchtime meetings where we discussed, and we asked these teachers, what do you think? First we opened it up. What do you think of this test, right? Before we really went into the action we wanted to take, we wanted to find out what educators thought of the MAP test. Are you getting useful feedback? Is this driving instruction? Right? Are you able to use this information and then scaffold students to better understanding? And across the board, teachers said, this is the most useless test that we have. It's not aligned to our curriculum, is the first thing. So the math teacher teaching 9th grade algebra told us he's seeing geometry questions on the test, which he told us would be like the Spanish teacher seeing French questions on the test. Yes, it's foreign language, right? But it's not the same subject. That's silly. So how are you going to base part of my evaluation on a test that's not aligned to the curriculum I'm teaching? You know, the ELL teachers talking about the way that humiliates the English language learners, and it's just not culturally and linguistically appropriate. You know, me as a history teacher, my problem with the test was that it's a computer-administered test, and that means that our computer labs are monopolized for weeks at a time, 3 times a year, so that the kids can't use the library to check out books or do research because it's testing, right, over and over. So if I assign a research project, the kids with internet at home, computers at home, time can do that. You know, the lower income, predominantly students of color who lack those resources are at a severe disadvantage. All these issues came out, and not only that, but the way that this test was adopted in the Seattle Public Schools, the former Superintendent Maria Goodlow-Johnson was on the Broad Foundation board. Eli Broad is one of the wealthiest people in the United States. He's using his wealth to undermine education. He has these superintendent academies where he trains people in corporate education reform and then places them in cities around the country. She came out of that, but she also sat on the board of the map test company, NWATE, and she didn't disclose that conflict of interest when the map test was adopted for $4 million by the Seattle Public Schools. So the state auditor came in and called that an ethics violation, right? So Garfield High School said, we're not going to administer an ethics violation. So once we knew we had a lot of support amongst the tested subject faculty, we decided, you know what, if this is going to be successful, it's got to be the entire school, so that those of us not in tested subjects, they can't use us to go proctor it instead, and so that this is a whole community speaking for best practices in education. And so we held after our staff meeting, we held our union meeting. One of the most exciting moments of my life was in the library at Garfield High School debating whether to do this. And everybody hated the test. The librarian, hated the test. I can't use the library. But the first question they asked was, well, you're the union rep, what are they going to do to us if we refuse to give the test? And I couldn't sugarcoat it. I had to be straight up. Look, if we're told to give this test and you refuse, you can be labeled insubordinate. And we do have a progressive discipline policy in the Seattle Public Schools, but ultimately you can be suspended without pay or terminated for being insubordinate. And I don't want to shock you, but those were not the words that inspired the staff to vote to boycott the test. Another teacher, Karen Gunn, an incredible math teacher at Garfield, stood up and she said, "I'm tired of seeing this test label students and teachers failures. The test is not even aligned to our curriculum. And I'd rather be reprimanded for standing up for what I believe in than just sitting back and letting this test run over us." And it was this incredible moment. I said, right there, it's time to vote. before anything else happened. So, called for the vote, and it was unanimous. And we all decided to do this. And then shortly after, we called a press conference in second floor room of a colleague of mine. And our first fear was no one would show up, and then they showed up, and then we were really scared. and we announced that we weren't going to give this test, and it just went everywhere. We couldn't believe how quickly national media, front page of Yahoo News, and all over the place, we were getting back and forth. Some, villainized, or people really inspired by it. And we didn't hear anything from the school district, though, for a few days. And we were really wondering, okay, we kept calling them, writing them, we'd like to have a meeting, let's talk about this. Nothing. Finally, an all-district email goes out from the superintendent. Very polite, but it's just like, just in case there was a lack of clarity, this test is mandatory. Right? And it was very nice, but the thing is, contractually, that was a very significant email because now we had been officially notified of our duties. Right? So now anything after that, it now can be labeled insubordinate. Funny thing happened though, he sent that email right before the lunch bell rang. And so we're all sitting at our desks in our different rooms at Garfield. I know my heart was racing. Like, wow, now, are we really going to go through with this? Like, no, this is, that was a lot of big talk we did. But the bell rings, and then on the intercom, our testing coordinator, and you got problems as a school district when your testing coordinator is organizing a boycott against the test. The testing coordinator comes on the intercom and says, the whole faculty needs to come to the staff lounge because a school in Florida has sent us pizza in solidarity with the math boycott. So we all come together, and it's over that pizza that I think teachers really realized this isn't just about us. Like, if we back down and give this test, it's not going to be just about what happens at Garfield. This is about teachers all over the country who have been tested and punished and who are sick of this corporate reform model destroying public education. And now there's a way of needing to fight this thing nationally, and also a lot of support and solidarity and strength that we gain from that. So some of the teachers said, you might want to keep that slice of pizza in case you don't have a paycheck. But we did finally get a meeting with the superintendent. The boycott was spreading, right? And several other schools picked it up in Seattle. Our brothers and sisters at Chief South High School and the Center School High School and Oaxaca K8 and Thornton Creek, and it began, and they realized they had a problem, and they had to figure out how to stop this. And so then the threat of a 10-day suspension without pay was officially issued, and an emergency staff meeting in every school across Seattle was called into a staff meeting, and this letter was read aloud to the faculty, and telling them what would happen if they joined the boycott, and telling us what would happen. And then right after that threat is when we got to get a meeting with the superintendent. We first met with him and laid out our concerns and set up another meeting for the following week. And when we didn't back down, and the threat the threat was, it was an amazing moment in my life, because at that moment, when every teacher at Garfield got together and we had another meeting and everybody decided we were going to continue, it was a moment where I saw an entire faculty lose its fear. And it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. You know, I'd read about it, I'd heard like my family who had been engaged in social activism and the civil rights movement and talk about that kind of thing. But to see people lose their fear and say, you know, if they suspend us, we'll come in and volunteer in our classrooms. And, you know, we will only spread this movement farther. And every threat was just made our faculty more emboldened. And they realized that that threat was only driving more thousands of people to sign online petitions, to send the photo that you guys took. I mean, those photos just buoyed our spirits. I can't even tell you, to see messages from faculties in high schools and schools all across the country, from teachers unions in Japan and British Columbia. We got a message from the union there to know that across the border they were inspired by our actions, was so uplifting and just helped encourage us to keep going. And they realized they needed another tactic to really put this down. Because our student body government voted unanimously to support the Garfield High School map test boycott, and then the PTA joined and voted unanimously to support the boycott. Now you have the three constituencies of Garfield united in this movement, and they realized, okay, the suspension threat didn't work. Their new tactic was demanding that the administration pull the students out of class, march them down to the lab, and administer it anyway over our wishes. So the superintendent sent that all-district communique the day before our second meeting, and we got a chance to meet with them a second time, and he comes into Garfield, and I just felt like he was coming into the lion's den, because, you know, we had a lot of confidence at that point. I graduated from Garfield High School. My mom was a PTA president. My brother and sister went there. My dad still teaches dance there. And, you know, this was our community you're coming into, and you're a new superintendent. And so we sat down with him, the five of us who were elected at Garfield to represent the boycott from the various departments, and our principal, and the superintendent and two of his representatives were there. And we again laid out for them the problems with this test, including our math teacher. This was wonderful. Actually, our language arts teacher had found out a year before at a district meeting that this, from a district official who just said in passing to her, you know, that at the high school level, the map test boycott the map test is not as useful because it has a higher margin of error than expected gains. And so our math teacher broke that down for the superintendent. That means it's statistically invalid as a tool at the high school level, right? No response, right? Our language arts teacher talked about all the things that she teaches in class that are not covered in the test. And we one after another, and just no response. So finally we had to do something to get through to them. So I said, you know, respectfully, sir, you're new to Seattle, and you know, your legacy as a superintendent is going to be decided by the outcome of this, you know, international now recognized boycott. And the way you approach this, people are going to remember for your tenure as a superintendent. And you're at a critical moment in your career. The decision you make in the next 24 hours is really going to seal your fate. If you decide to side with the map company that made this test, the corporate reformers that are screaming to implement this, the Seattle Times that is editorializing about how teachers don't want to be accountable, and the Gates Foundation that wants this. If you side with them over the unanimous vote of the students, parents, and teachers at Garfield High School, you will forever be irrelevant to the educational community. He didn't like that. But I offered him something. I said, look, if you back off the threats, right, and say you want to work with us, when I go on CNN next week, I'll tell them we have a real educational leader in Seattle Public Schools. He really didn't like that. That wrapped up the meeting pretty quick. So he went ahead with it. And he mandated that our principal and assistant principals go class by class and pull the kids out and march them off to the computer lab. Here's the problem, though. Right? The students now had to not just vote. If this boycott was going to continue, it wasn't just about students and parents voting to support us. Now they actually had to take action themselves. And this is where I think it really turned into a social movement, where it became all of our communities coming together to reclaim the purpose of education. And I have a short video clip I could show you. It's 2 minutes, but it's interviews with the students the day after they were being asked to come out and take this test. And what happened is absolutely amazing. The students, I'll just set it up by saying that in classroom after classroom, students staged a sit-in in their own classroom, right? Refusing to get up and take the standardized test. Often they had tests that the teachers had developed that were actually testing the things they had learned in the classroom, and they weren't going to leave that test to go take a non-aligned test, right? And then the parents flooded our school with opt-out letters by the hundreds, right? And so this is the day after they were being asked to pull out. Really great interviews.
Well, it's been really inspiring to watch the teachers take a stand against this, because it really does make a difference.
We want to keep reiterating that the students aren't going to take it. Like, we're not going to take it. Like, not get the 3600. We need to have the solidarity we have.
Some of these kids have been taking the test since 3rd grade now or something. So they've taken it 30-some times. I took it 4 times in my freshman year. And so they have a completely different mentality coming in.
Yesterday was a big day because a lot of people had a choice to opt out of the test. A lot of people didn't really want to take the test. And about the math test, it's really useless.
The system principal gave me, he told it, he didn't pull the bill, and it was just not loud enough, right? Oh, God. I'll back that. Thank you. I just, it's not enough.
Yeah, this next part you're going to want to hear. Well, that kid Cedric really nails it. There you go.
I got the test. A lot of people didn't really want to take the test. And about the math test, it's really useless.
The assistant principal came in and he told us that since we didn't get an email or a call from our parent, we have to take it. So we went down to the library and they told us either we could contact our parents right now, which I'm putting because my mom's at work. They told us then we don't have to take it, but otherwise we're forced to take it.
They came and took all of us on the class, a handful of people on the class, and I was one of them. But I was like, wait, no, I opted out. So she was like, okay, we'll still come down there. And I was like, no. So I stayed in class, I sat down in class, I sat in class, and we waited for everybody else that was done with the test.
I stayed outside of the computer lab at the board, and I made the decision to not enter. And
I really feel like it's a recognition requirement is really a waste of time. And so I have no time to waste, especially as a freshman. Because when they say as a freshman, it's harder than a senior, junior, and a sophomore. So I don't really have time to waste, so that's why I really want to opt for Mom, can you please? I said, it's an emergency, and it's very urgent. So can you please opt me out of this test? She totally agreed. But I had to explain to her that this has nothing to do with high school.
It's a waste of time. Like, I had a test that's going to affect my real grade, and then I couldn't even take my test because I had to do student night tests.
This wasn't going to be perfect all the time. Everything that's happening above you isn't always right.
Yeah, so the students who did go, right, to take the test often just hit random buttons. So the number of valid scores was minuscule, right? If you take the test in 30 seconds, it invalidates the test. And so it meant there was almost no valid tests administered. And we defeated the MAP through parents, students, and teachers refusing the test. It was an incredible day to see it all come together like that. And it just absolutely, the best part about it absolutely freaked out the corporate education reformers. Right? Michelle Reed, you guys know Michelle Reed?
Yeah.
Oh boy. Michelle Reed, the darling of the corporate reformers, appearing on the cover of Time magazine with the stern teachers into submission. She took it upon herself to write an op-ed in the Seattle Times talking about how this was about teachers not wanting to be held accountable. And we were able to completely destroy that argument because we have the unity of all the groups, and we explained what this was really about, right? The corporate reformers were so upset because standardized testing is the lifeblood of their movement. Everything they're trying to do to dismantle public education hinges on reducing the intellectual process of teaching and learning to a single number that they can use to close schools, that they can use to deny students graduation, that they can use to fire teachers, that they can use to privatize education, right, by shutting the schools down and then opening up charters that are not part of a democratic system, right, that don't have the oversight of a democratically elected school board. And so I think their entire movement hinges on this process, and we were denying them the lifeblood of their system, the data points that they need for this whole process to unfold, right? And it's all about commodifying education, to see education as a commercial good rather than a public good. And I think that it just drove them absolutely crazy. To see us really show what a civil rights movement looks like, right? Arnie Duncan called Waiting for Superman, the corporate reform movie, the civil rights moment of our time, the Rosa Parks moment, he said. The Rosa Parks moment of our time. But if I remember right, I don't think billionaires were backing the civil rights movement. And I think that our movement looked much more like the grassroots movement to reclaim education, and we face tremendous challenges, just social crises in our world today. We have mass incarceration, where there's more black people behind bars today than were slaves on plantations in 1850. It's just an absolute catastrophe for African American society. We have an epidemic of violence against women in our society, where we just saw most tragically with the horrible shootings and stabbings. But that comes from a culture, a rape culture that exists on way too many campuses across the United States, that's fostered in locker rooms and jock culture often, but extends, I think, through a horribly misogynist society. We have endless wars, the longest war in U.S. history that's just draining our treasury at a time that when we have, just an economic stagnation and mass inequality, right? The biggest moment of income inequality in U.S. history, at least since the days of the robber barons, in the Gilded Age. You know, and probably the biggest social catastrophe of all is the ecological crisis that we're facing. With climate change, you know, we have the increasing disasters that we're facing around the country. Hurricane Sandy and devastation of the Philippines recently with that storm. But we're talking about water levels rising that are going to flood entire major metropolitan areas in the not too distant future, right? The very survival of humanity rests in the balance of the decisions that we make as a society in the next few years, right? And none of those problems can be solved by bubbling A, B, C, or D. We have to have a whole different purpose of education and a whole different way of, I think, assessing education, right? We need to cultivate collaboration in the classroom for the very survival of our species. We have to cultivate imagination and critical thinking to challenge those who would, you know, profit off of these social catastrophes until there's nothing left, right? We have to cultivate a whole different set of skills. The purpose of education is not just to be career and college ready, but to solve real life problems that we face in our world today. And to do that, we have to have a whole different set of assessments that nurture the skills that we actually need to value. Right? And so we at Garfield High School have partnered with a school in New York that's doing this. Right? This is an innovative high school, consortium of high schools called the New York Consortium Schools for Performance-Based Assessment. And I highly recommend people, there's an article about it on my blog that you should read about what this school does. These are public schools. Right? They're not charter schools or any privatized hybrid. Right? It shows the type of innovation you can do in the current public school system. They have a waiver from the standardized tests, and instead they do performance-based assessment. Performance-based assessment is what you do when you get your PhD. Because at some levels in this country, they actually want you to be able to think. Right? I mean, not down there, they want to rank and sort you for who's going to be a low-wage worker and who. But when you reach a certain level, they want new ideas and innovation and thinking, so they don't have you fill in bubbles. They have you do research, right? Then they have you. I haven't done it yet, so I don't know. But my understanding is, then you come up with a thesis, and then if you're with an advisor and revise your thesis, and finally, when you have your finished work, you defend your thesis in front of a panel of experts who know something about it. And this is what they're doing at the consortium schools in New York, right? And can be done K-12 in every subject. You can do research over time. It can be age-appropriate research, right? And the age-appropriate defense of your dissertation, right, or your thesis for kindergarten. But it's an issue that matters to you. It's something that you've researched and you're explaining yourself so that we can actually understand how you came to that answer. Because standardized testing hides more than it reveals. I don't know how that student came to that answer. Were they almost at the right answer? Maybe there was multiple right answers oftentimes on these tests. Maybe they had an incredibly innovative way of thinking about it that helped them arrive at the wrong answer, right? There's so many things that are hidden by that actually explaining your ideas makes a lot more sense. And so teachers at Garfield said from the beginning, our struggle wasn't just about eliminating the map test. It was about authentic assessment, right? And reclaiming assessment. We didn't do this boycott so we weren't accountable. We believe in accountability because if we want social justice, then we actually have to have our schools be accountable to educating Black youth, to Native youth, to Latino youth, to Asian youth, to our low-income students. We have to have a school system that educates all of our students, and and so we need accountability, but to what, right? To Pearson's bottom line, to the Pearson Testing Corporation that is a multi-billion-dollar company, or do we want accountability to social justice? So our teachers have been flying there and coming back and holding trainings for our staff at Garfield, and it's just been an incredible experience to see our staff, reclaiming our classrooms from the billionaires. And I'll just end and take questions, but I'll end by saying that if you don't believe what I'm saying here today, there's one easy way. There's a quick test you can do to see if I'm telling you the truth. Because at Lakeside High School, hope Doug's going to talk about Lakeside. It's a high school not too far from Garfield in Seattle, and it's where Bill Gates went, and it's where his kids go. I've often said that actually it's Lakeside High School that started the map test boycott, right? Because they never administered the boycott way before Garfield, and actually they don't administer standardized, they don't inundate their kids with standardized testing every year, monopolizing the library. So they have a library with, 50,000 volumes, right? They have, they want their classrooms to be space for critical thinking, because at that school they're developing the next generation of people who are going to run society, right? So at that school they want time for imagination and critical thinking in the classroom, right? They have spas for the kids there. They have international programs. The kids study abroad for a year in high school. Wonderful things that all of our kids, and we're saying if it's good enough for your kids, it should be good enough for ours, right? And so we think that would be a good place to start for the corporate education reformers to advocate for the same things that their kids get in the schools for all of ours. We go beyond what their kids are being taught, but let's start by lowering class size and giving teachers the autonomy and space to teach and to develop and to assess. So thank you guys.
I built it in. We have time for questions.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, you talked a lot about how the teachers at Garfield were able, and sort of it sounds like already had a culture that said, we know what our curriculum is, and they hadn't been pre-aligned. So I'm wondering how you sort of didn't go through this tendency, right, to shrink what you did to the test, and how, if you could talk a little bit about how there's this phenomenon of assuming the standards of curriculum are synonymous.
Yeah.
Disentangle that.
Well, see, the problem is the map was just one of the tests that we give at Garfield. So, unfortunately, there was a process of shrinking the curriculum to the other tests. I mean, we have the end of course exams, right? We have the MSP, and we have the HISP. So the kids would take 5 or 6, depending on what year you were, standardized tests without the map. And then the map was 3 times a year, right? So that's what I meant, the explosion of standardized testing with the federal education policy of No Child Left Behind, then Race to the Top, and now Common Core. I mean, Common Core is going to be an absolute train wreck for our nation's schools, mostly because of the standardized tests that are. Whatever you think of the standards themselves, and in some places the standards are liberating to some teachers because they're in scripted curriculum settings where they have to read off a page every day what to tell the kids, right? And so there, for teachers in those situations, we've heard, the standards are going to free us up to teach the more broad concepts. And I can appreciate that, but the problem is the Smarter Balance test and the PARCC assessments are the same tired old test and punish that's been happening since W.E.B. Du Bois began the fight in the 1920s. And now, next year, we got rid of the map. Now smarter balance and a new ELA test, right? So there's the victory. At the end of the school year, the superintendent sent us a note saying the map test would be optional next year, and we got a decisive win where we no longer had to give that test this year and have more time for teaching and learning. An incredible victory. But now next year, here we go again.
We're wondering about building level administration. With you,
Yeah.
how did that?
Yeah. So it's been a tricky process of explaining their role because they were very vulnerable to attacks from the school district and don't have the same kind of union representation. But I was very happy when Yes Magazine interviewed our principal, and he was very forthright about really appreciating the work that us teachers have been doing in developing authentic assessment. And he went out to the consortium school in New York with our teachers and was just amazed by the paradigm shift of what assessment could look like. And has been very, very supportive, and I think that was critical to our success.
Were they supportive of the boycott?
Well, they couldn't be openly supportive of the boycott because they would have quickly been reprimanded. So we have to be careful about how we describe their participation. But I think if they had come down very hard on us, it could have been a whole different situation. It could have scattered the staff and people been a lot more fearful. Yeah.
As you talked about the schools in Seattle, what about the surrounding areas in Seattle, Tacoma, Fairway, and all those? Were they on board with you as well?
I mean, right after we got the pizza from Florida, we got chocolate sent to us from the Snohomish County School District schools there sent up. So there was a lot of support we got from the region, for sure. It didn't spread, but the map boycott was a district assessment. It's not a statewide assessment, so there weren't other, I think there might have been one or two other districts that used it, but so it wasn't a boycott that spread throughout the area, but the solidarity was incredible, and our state union voted to support our actions that year, which was great. Yeah.
So the Chiefs National and other schools there show their support as well?
Yeah, there was the Indian Heritage School at Seattle that they've tried to shut down now for many years, and we just had a battle. We stopped them from shutting it down. We co-located it. Yeah, we got support. I mean, pretty much every teacher knows that these tests are robbing us of our ability to teach, and the solidarity was what fueled us, kept us going. I mean, my son was born actually on Martin Luther King's birthday, that January 15th, just right when it was 2 days after we launched the map boycott, my son was born. And so I was not sleeping, it was just like the most wonderful, incredible things that had ever happened to me in my life, all happening at once, and just completely exhausting. But it was like every day getting a new message of support from a school around the country, in our districts, around the world. Like the teachers in Oaxaca that I've been following their battles for years, sending us a message of support was like just breathtaking. And it's what fueled, it really made the difference to keep our energy going, to be able to see this thing through.
Yeah, thank you, by the way. I think that you made the conference good work for you. I think we need this so badly. I wondered if you could speak a little bit to maybe the ideological
simplicity. Like I just went to their website, and they give parents and teachers there's this illusion of choice, or this illusion of success, and no matter who you are, you will succeed. In this way, the test narrows in on the student's learning level, engaging them with content that allows them to succeed. So I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about the language of the test makers.
Oh yeah, so you're at the NWEA map test website?
Yeah, I think I am.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing. So the map test is an adaptive test. People know about that, so you take it and you get the question right, they get harder. You get the question wrong, they get easier. And this is an amazing new science, right? It is now going to pinpoint where the students are academically. I mean, it's incredible the way they talk about innovation in assessment. It's the same ABCD test that they were taking in W.E.B. Du Bois's time when he was revolted. It's the same thing, but now because they can use technology to get a little bit harder and a little bit easier, it's revolutionary, right? And the students, they don't let us really use the program at all, right? So we don't even know what's on the test. The way we know that it's not aligned is because we're looking over the shoulders of kids as they're taking it and like, what? How do you teach that? But the kids will tell you that all of a sudden they get like a 4th grade reading question and give up at that point. I'm that dumb. I just got this question. That's what my student told me, right? And it humiliates them. And then they give up on the test. That is amazing new technology. The claims are outrageous, and we actually got a chance to debate the map company. Wayne Allen, who's a professor of education at the UW-Bothell, and he's on the board of Rethinking Schools magazine. If you guys don't know the magazine, you should check it out. It inspired me to do this work, and I was fortunate enough to be asked to join the editorial board this year. An incredible experience it's been. And Wayne Allen, who's been a long-time editor for Rethinking Schools, and he's written, I think, the most important works on standardized testing. His book, Unequal by Design, should be mandatory reading. Unequal by Design walks you through this history of how standardized testing is used to reproduce class and racial inequality. And so he got to sit on the stage at NWEA and spar. It was beautiful. And they really don't have very much to back up those claims when you start asking them, how is this test really different in terms of the way it ranks and sorts our children? They don't have many answers.
Advice to other teacher educators who are preparing future teachers.
So stick with people in this program who brought me out here. It sounds like a good program. I think I don't recommend a TFA, first of all. I think really learning the methods that empower students to share their stories is critical to transforming the classroom. And I think that anything you do with activism has to start in the classroom. I think it was because many of us in the school had a reputation as being good educators, we were able to do this other work. And I think but it takes both, though. It takes the commitment to social justice pedagogy in the classroom and also activism outside the classroom. They have to go hand in hand. And I think, developing that discussion in education programs makes a lot of sense to me. I'll tell you, I'll just end on that question with this story. I've never had a more successful lesson than when I taught my students last year about the Montgomery bus boycott. Right? Can you imagine how that came to life in the middle of the math test boycott? They're like, I'm breaking them off into groups of the different constituencies in Montgomery, and they have to, and it's a debate, should we do this boycott? Because, you know, you have the more well-off black clergy who have one set of circumstances and obstacles, and then you have people who, like Rosa Parks, who, you know, very working class and have other risks and challenges that they have to, and you have a women's association, and so there's different organizations that have to figure out, are we going to actually carry this through, and what are the consequences going to be? And the students are researching those groups and debating each other and discussing about how to organize this boycott, and they were fierce, right? This mattered in a new way because it wasn't about what had happened back then. It was about how do we learn these lessons for a boycott that we're actively engaged in ourselves. And I think, you know, understanding the connection between pedagogy and also activism is critical to transforming our students. I don't know who was next.
Had a meeting a few weeks ago in Cannes, partly sponsored by you called Badass Teachers.
Yeah.
Comment about that?
Yeah, the Badass Teachers, one of the co-founders is Mark Mason, and he contributed a great chapter to the book that I'm editing that's coming out in September, More Than a Score. And the Badass Teachers Association is an amazing phenomenon. It started as this website that Mark Mason, a professor at Fordham University, and some other classroom teachers and parents launched, and it just snowballed. Like tens of thousands of teachers have done. It's at like 40,000 teachers now nationally are part of the Badass Teachers Association, and they are doing actions like in Seattle. At the end of June, there's another national march going to the Gates Foundation, and this Badass Teachers are one of the primary sponsors of it. They're remaking teachers' unions, and they're all about challenging corporate ed reform and standardized testing. So I'm a fan of their work. Yeah.
I was wondering if you, I can see how easily it would be to get the like you said, something real for them right now, present too, because I think they think they're showing us like that one person kept saying it's a waste of time. I was saying as a freshman came back after this last RAPS test here in Pullman and said, yeah, it's a big joke. We try to miss as many answers as we possibly can. Because it means nothing to
Easier
them.
questions.
It doesn't affect. Yeah. I was wondering though, was your building already a very active teachers association? Was it 100% vote yes, or did you have a couple,
Yeah.
that didn't vote to go with you on the boycott?
So we did have 3 abstentions in that vote. Nobody voted against it. And the abstentions, those people ended up being some of the most active members of the boycott. They were worried about the consequences, like they should be, but it was an incredibly unified movement. And I think the question you asked, I think the question you ask is so important because it is the work we did beforehand that I think laid the groundwork for it to be unified. I'll tell this quick story because it is so often the stuff that's happened years before that helps something like this happen. And I don't often have enough time to explain it, but so the year before the MAP boycott at Garfield, the state legislature was getting ready to cut $2 billion from public education and healthcare in the state of Washington, you guys might remember. And, the McCleary decision, right, is now, but that was before the McCleary decision. But the lower court had ruled that the state was out of compliance with the law in terms of education funding, right? Because the Washington State Constitution says that education is the paramount duty, and that has been clarified in lawsuits that say we have to spend over 50% of our budget on education. And that hasn't happened, so a King County Superior Court judge ruled that our state legislature was breaking the law. So when they announced that they were going to cut $2 billion from education, a group of us teachers and the social equality educators decided that if they're going to break the law, they should be held accountable. So we went down to the Capitol at the session when they were getting ready to make these cuts, and the Occupy movement was down there protesting, and unions were down there. But our group of teachers got into the actual House Ways and Means Committee meeting where they actually do the budget cutting before they locked the doors because all the protesters were outside. And when they gavelled in the session, I stood up and said, we did a mic check, and I read out, I said we're at the scene of a crime, and, oh man, what did I say? Some crazy stuff. We read out the state constitution. We said it was the paramount duty and they should, fund education. And we had a big banner that said citizens arrest. And I had come prepared with citizens arrest warrants that I came up to the legislature, and my final act was holding up the plastic handcuffs and saying, okay, you all need to come with me into my custody now. And the state trooper didn't think it was as funny as you guys thought. And he arrested me. So I was pulled out, and the place went wild. They had to cancel the meeting because everybody, and all the activists outside. And I spent the evening in jail. And I get to Garfield the next morning, and one of my students runs up to me. It's like, Mr. Hagopian, it worked! And I was like, what do you mean? I was really nervous, by the way, because I didn't know if the families were going to be like, oh, I'm going to pull my kid out of this criminal's classroom, or what the buzz of all the students was going to be. What do you mean it worked? And he was like, well, I started a Facebook page called Free Mr. Hagopian. I was like, you need to take a civics class. But I appreciated it. And then he changed the Facebook page from Free Mr. Hagopian to Walk Out Against the Budget Cuts. And that was on his own. I didn't even know. So the next day, all these kids come to school with signs that say "Fund Our Future" and all these. And the next day they made a pamphlet. They stayed up all night making a pamphlet showing what the budget cuts had done to Garfield High School. The elimination of foreign language at senior year, of science classes. They got rid of summer school. We can't afford, so the kids who fall behind in credits don't have any way to retrieve those credits. We know who that punishes the most. And I couldn't believe. These were the kids that I had gone through the whole year, the year before in American history, teaching about every social movement that I could teach them about. And here they were on their own, I'd always thought, well, someday they'll remember something I taught them about the abolitionists, and they'll put it in the seed. Like that happened. It was a mass. 500 kids walked out of Garfield and marched down to the mayor's office, and they demanded an audience with him. He came out. They actually said, good for you guys for taking initiative in your education. They should fund the schools. They are breaking the law. And they got their picture in the New York Times, even, about the growing youth movement. And I felt like that really was the start of the map. Like the students showing us what's possible with collective action. Because just a few weeks after that, that was the McCleary decision where our state Supreme Court ruled that the legislature is breaking the law. Right? And now that decision is guiding, they're still breaking the law. They won't even listen to the state Supreme Court. It's amazing. Like if one of my kids goes across the street to the corner store and steals a candy bar, they're going to be in jail. But here our legislatures breaking the paramount duty of our Constitution, the highest law, and they walk around free. It's incredible society that we live in, but the power of collective action really, I think, taught us teachers a lesson, right? And I think we learned that lesson from them and applied it the next year. Okay. One more.
And so they're not that strong. You know, they're afraid because they want a job. And so, you know, how do you address that? You know, some consciousness of what's right versus what it means.
That's a great question. Before I answer that, let me just do one thing because I know we're wrapping up. And there's an initiative to lower class size in Washington State. I'm wondering if you're a Washington State voter, I could pass out that initiative. Has everyone signed it already? Let me send it just in case someone hasn't, or I'll leave it up here if you haven't signed it. You know, this is real education reform, right? Something that could really help our students. So I have petitions to lower class size, and if you haven't signed it, if you're a Washington State voter, please do. But I'm glad you asked that question because it's one of the ways that they maintain their power, right? Is all keeping us in debt and then needing these jobs and following the rules in order to pay off this debt is a key tool of maintaining. How do you get a society like we have, where the wealth is concentrated so much in the 1%, right? 86 people in the world have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the planet. That is an obscene revelation that in a new study that came out. How do they maintain a society like that? A lot of it is about keeping us in fear, and a lot of that fear is how are we going to pay for our kids, you know, or make the mortgage payment or the student debt payment. We can't fight back and rock the boat because there's so much at risk. You know, all of the teachers at Garfield had to think about that. And one of the things we made clear at that first meeting when we voted to boycott was we said to everyone, we're not all in the same financial situation. There are some teachers in this room who have more dependents than others, right? Some teachers have, you know, they're underwater in their mortgage, and there's different financial situations. So if you decide not to join the boycott, we're not going to ostracize you. We're not going to say you're a sellout or you're just going along with the system. Like, we respect your individual decision. And I think because we foregrounded that and we were conscious of that, it actually invited people in to participate. I think you have to start by recognizing that. But you also have to recognize that there's a tremendous amount of power in collective action. And if it's just you, it is scary. And there will be consequences, and you might get fired. But if it's every teacher in the school, what are they going to do? Are they going to fire every teacher at Garfield High School? The flagship, you know, jazz program in the nation, right? They would. Collective action is I've read about it for years, and I finally can tell you face to face that it works, right? And that's the key. That all the billions in wealth that they have, and all the political connections that they have, and the media mouthpiece that screamed against our boycott, all of that was completely impotent in the face of mass collective action. They had nothing. They mostly got quiet. Seattle has all of these Gates-funded Everform groups. I mean, they're lobbying every day for more standardized testing. But after they saw the size of this thing, they got quiet. They didn't want to get on the wrong side of the boycott and be stigmatized by parents now. Right? And so I would just say that engage in that collective struggle because I've seen it able to overcome the wealthy.
How did you educate your parents to get their own?
Well, we went to the PTA meeting and presented our case.
And not always. I mean, that's just like a union meeting. That's a small group of parents, or that small group of parents disseminated within their own.
Yep, they used their newsletter and their blog, and they got the word out, and the parents were already open, I think, to this moment, and and it was because they knew that it was like we were very committed to their kids' education, and we came and presented the flaws in this test, and were persuasive and got their vote, and then we got them to opt out. And that it was when they actually joined, right? When they sent the hundreds of opt-out letters that really pulled the struggle together and made it pretty possible. So thanks everyone for your time.